be given status and prestige or denied status and prestige. So there are certain languages that have more status than others. English, of course, is a language that has a lot of status globally. Okay, but not all varieties of English have the same kind of status. We'll also be looking at the impact that language attitudes have on people's perceptions of language and identity. So by language attitudes, really, and I'll go into this in more detail in a moment, but by language attitudes, I mean the value judgments that people make with regard to different varieties of language, particularly the way speakers of different varieties use language differently from ourselves. Okay, and in doing that, we will also be uncovering the language ideologies that underpin these value judgments. So where do these value judgments come from? Okay, what are the beliefs underlying them or underpinning them? And then finally, we will explore the relationship between language and identity in some depth and think about the impact that language ideologies can have on how we identify, but also how others identify us or how others position us. All right. So just as a backdrop, I'd like you to look at this text. I've got here a piece of text. And my question is this: do you know this language? Okay. Have a look at that. Does this look familiar in any way? I imagine that you might, if you look carefully at this, you'll be able to identify words that look familiar. So if we look at line 2, we can see the word end, his. In line 3, we have he. Line 4, there's or, he again, till. Right, so there are sort of identifiable words after, okay, different spelling, but after, that look like English, okay? Now what this is Old English. This is from the 9th century. So it's an Old English text. And the reason I'm showing this text is just to illustrate how much language can change over time. And this is a really core concept in thinking about language from a social perspective. If we're thinking about the social properties of language, a key aspect of this is acknowledging that languages vary quite considerably and also change over time. And that change, if we compare different versions of the language across different centuries, that change can be quite dramatic. Right? So that's the 9th century. If we look at the second extract, have a look at this for a moment. I'll give you time to read that. Okay, now I don't know if any of you have studied English literature. This may be familiar to some of you, but if you look here closely at the text, there are many more identifiable words. Okay, when, that, April, showers, that's actually showers, drought, March, every. So there are some archaic spellings. So some of the words look familiar, but are written in a different way than we would write them in contemporary English. But it's much closer to the way we use English now. And this text, I don't know if any of you recognize it, this is from Chaucer. You've got a translation on the right. So that's the modern English translation. All right. So this is what we call Middle English, and this is from the Canterbury Tales written by Geoffrey Chaucer, who lived between 1345 and 1400. So this is what English looked like in the 14th century. Okay, so if we go back quickly, quite a big difference from extract 1, 9th century, to extract 2, 14th century. So 500 years has changed the language very dramatically. What we can see next, extract 3, possibly this one is much more recognizable. Probably more of you will be familiar with this. It's much easier to read. So extract 2, lots of familiar words, but it's very difficult to know how to read that. And it does require some translation into modern English. This is from, if you haven't recognized it, Shakespeare. All right, so this is Elizabethan English. This is what we regard as early modern English. All right, so it's when modern English first begins. So it's 16th century. And you can see the change between extract 2, Chaucer, 14th century, and extract 3, Shakespeare, 16th century, is much smaller than the change between extract 1 and extract 2. All right. So that's just a little bit of preliminary introduction because it connects with some really important points that I'm going to make. Okay. That it connects with the way in which the concept of language variation and language change. So if language didn't vary and language didn't change, then we would all speak in the same way. We would all use our languages in an identical fashion, but of course we don't. So this gives rise to people making value judgments about the way other people speak our language. Okay, we make value judgments about other languages when we contrast them to our first language, and we make value judgments about different ways of speaking our first language. All right? And this is quite commonplace. So simply put, we can say that attitudes are perceptions, orientations, assumptions, and expectations about something, all right, about different phenomena. In our case, language and languages. All right. So put another way, in relation to language attitudes, Sarnoff described this as dispositions to react favorably or unfavorably to a class of objects. So it's not just your perception, orientation, and assumption. It's also the attitudes that you have in relation to language will mean that you're more or less likely to behave in a particular way or to respond in a particular way when you hear someone speaking. Okay, so if we look at a dictionary definition, this is from the Cambridge Online Dictionary of the word attitude. It really gives us it sees attitude as a synonym of opinion. All right, so it describes it as a feeling or opinion about something or someone or a way of behaving that is caused by this opinion. All right. So, and that's to a certain extent, yes, that's true in relation to language attitudes as well. Okay. An important point here is, interestingly, the first example, it's often very difficult to change people's attitudes, is particularly relevant from a language attitudes perspective. Okay. So when we're thinking about opinions, perhaps we hold on to those opinions quite strongly. This is particularly the case in relation to language or languages. All right. Here you've got a more specific definition of language attitudes. And again, it illustrates the enduring quality of language attitudes. In other words, that they do not change very easily. So the relatively enduring orientations that an individual develops towards various objects and issues they encounter. Okay, it says here that an individual develops, but what's really important to signal is that our attitudes towards language are not completely individual. We learn these attitudes through social interaction, okay, through our social groups that we belong to. And another point here in the second sentence, obviously attitudes contain elements of value and belief, as well as varying degrees of factual knowledge. Or what's really, again, important from the perspective of language attitudes, what the holder, so the person who has this attitude, takes to be factual knowledge. So it might not be factual, but we might see it as factual. We might think that it is factual. Okay, here are some examples of commonplace language attitudes. These are examples of the kinds of things people have typically said about languages. All right, these are I've taken these from a book that's entitled Language Myths. Okay, it's an edited collection of articles that discuss these beliefs about language from an applied linguistics perspective. So from a specialist linguistics perspective, explaining why people have these beliefs and then examining to what extent there is any truth in those beliefs or whether or not they are myths. And the conclusion is that these are all myths about language, but what's important to acknowledge is they are very commonly held. They are popular beliefs. So, for example, if we take number one, the meanings of words should not be allowed to vary or change. There's a very common perception when we ask people what they think about language or what they believe in relation to language, people are not necessarily very aware of how much language changes over time. All right. So, and we'll come back to this later on in the lecture. But for now, what I want you to think about is this question here. What does the word nice mean? So if someone asked you to give a definition of the word nice, what would you say? Right, and I'm going to come back to that later on to illustrate how this word has changed over time. Okay, so that's other attitudes or other common beliefs about language are that some languages are more difficult than others to learn. Some languages have no grammar. Bad grammar is slovenly. So quite negative beliefs. You know, double negatives are illogical in English. So this is a double negative in English would be I don't know nothing. Right, that's often described as illogical. Okay. Number 6, everyone has an accent except me. Some languages are more primitive than others. Some native speakers do not use their language properly. Now, I haven't got time to go into each one of these in any depth. All right. I want to focus especially on number 1 and on number 6. Right. Everyone has an accent except me. So this is really illustrative of how people see their own language use in relation to the language use of other people. Yeah. So just to reiterate, all of these beliefs in language are sort of there's an element of myth in them. There's not very much truth in them from a linguistics perspective. Okay. So the point about number 6 is we see our own language, the way we speak our language, as normal, and other people have an accent, but we don't. But in fact, everyone has an accent, including yourself. Yeah. So even if you speak the very standard variety of your language and you have a prestigious accent, and so in English, this might be an RP accent, a received pronunciation accent in British English, that is an accent. There's no such thing as speaking a language without an accent. Okay. But people often believe that there is. This is just an illustration of the kinds of work that researchers do when studying language attitudes. Now, you don't need to see the detail here. My point is simply to illustrate one of the tools that researchers draw on. So very often, what you might recognize here is on the left, you've got a map of Britain, Great Britain, and then on the right, a map of the United States, obviously not to scale, okay? The map of Britain on this map here would be tiny, would be down here, not much bigger than Florida, okay? So this is, as I say, one method that researchers use to identify different attitudes that speakers have towards different languages. So in a study such as this, the research participants are asked to identify places on a map and use words to describe the way people speak who live in those places. So they might comment on their accent, they might comment on their dialect. And it's a way of identifying different beliefs that people have about accents and language differences in those contexts. Okay. Here, another research tool that people use, or another method that people draw on when studying language attitudes, is to ask them to look at examples of written or spoken text and then get them to do a rating exercise. So they give a score to each example, saying how standard or non-standard it is, how intelligent the speaker is, and so on. So here are some that I've got. Okay, and I've used these prompts with students of mine in the past, and what you have here are examples. Some of them are standard English, some of them are non-standard English, but a lot of them tend to provoke certain responses or certain attitudes. Okay, particularly the ones that are associated more with a non-standard variety. Okay, so what I'm going to do is pause there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, all right, and ask you to discuss. We'll try this we'll do one breakout room. Well, okay, let me just open the chat. Geoffrey Chaucer, yes, Victorian, not Victorian English, but good guess. All right. Yeah, but you were right with Chaucer. Excellent. So I'm going to organize you into groups. How many people have got? Well, 57 people. Right. That's quite a lot of groups. Okay. So I'm just going to put you into groups of around 5 or 6 of you for just for a few minutes. And what I want you to do is discuss those examples. All right. What I'll do is I'll cut and paste, I'll copy them. Let me end my presentation. All right. And I will copy them and put them in the chat. All right. You won't be able to, I think you won't be able to see the chat in, so you got them there, all right, in the chat. Once you're in the breakout room, I don't think you'll be able to see the chat, so maybe copy them now if you can. All right, and as I said, I'll give you just a few minutes to look at those, think about them, and discuss them together. Are they standard? Are they non-standard? Are they examples of good English or not good English? All right, so we're going to test what your attitudes are towards these different versions of English. All right. Okay, so I'm just going to open the breakout rooms now. Okay, great. Thank you very much. So I think everybody's back now.
It's
Hopefully,
not
yeah,
enough.
you okay? Was there not enough time?
Not enough time.
Okay, sorry. We haven't got, I have, yeah. It's, I mean, you could spend a lot of time talking about these. I'll go back, thank you for doing that. I'll go back to my slides, and then we can discuss them together. Okay. So, right. If, I mean, there are several, we could spend a lot of time discussing each one. The main point that I want to make is that these are all they're all examples of very commonly used English. These are all produced by native speakers of English, by British English speakers. Many of them are considered non-standard, and some of them provoke quite strong reactions. All right. One that does tend to provoke strong reactions is number 4. There are far less people involved nowadays, because this is different from the conventional standard form, which would be there are far fewer people involved nowadays. So in standard English grammar, we make a distinction between less and fewer when we are describing a noun. If the noun is uncountable, then we use less. If it's countable and plural, then we use fewer. All right. But it's a distinction, that grammatical distinction has largely been lost. It's disappeared in spoken English. It's still, you can still see it to a certain extent in written English, and English language teaching textbooks will often have a section where they contrast less with fewer. All right. But in spoken English, in everyday spoken English, even speakers of standard English will use less with a plural noun. Yeah, like people, rather than fewer. Okay, so it's very commonplace. I mean, there are several of them, as I say, that tend to provoke quite strong reactions. I'm more interested in how people react to these examples of language than analysing the examples themselves. So here are some undergraduate students from King's College London and what they said when presented with these same examples. Right. So one of the students said, "Well, it shouldn't, but it kind of annoys me." They found some of the examples annoying. One student said they made a distinction between where they see it. So if it's an informal example of language use, so for example on Facebook, it would be fine to use language in this way, but it wouldn't be acceptable in an essay. If you were writing an essay for university then, or for school, then you wouldn't be able to use language in this way. And then a couple of people commented that they were aware that they themselves used some of these forms when they spoke English. So one student said, "It's the sort of thing that I change in my writing in case other people say it's wrong." So people are aware that the way they use language is going to be judged by other people, and it might be described as wrong. Okay. And also that they felt annoyed by it, some of these examples, even though they use them themselves. Right. So this is a good illustration of how strongly we believe in standard language. Okay, so I'm aware that I use language in this way myself, but I'm still annoyed by it when I see it. Okay, so really strong indication there of how this impacts on people's beliefs. And just to illustrate that further, here are some examples of language attitudes that have been recorded in the media, okay, from newspapers. And this is quoted from a book on global Englishes by Jennifer Jenkins. And you can see here that people's responses, these are all written in response to an English, sort of British English accent spoken in London, okay? So it's lazy speaking, extremely bad. I mean, that's very interesting. It's not just describing the accent as lazy speaking. It's commenting on how this accent can have an impact on children's behavior. So there's like a moral assumption here. People relating non-standard language use with moral behavior, okay? people are described as idiots if they have this accent. And this last one is particularly alarming, I think. The mouths uttering it deserve to be stuffed with broken glass. So quite a violent image. And these are all responses to someone speaking with a particular accent. Okay. Now, very quickly, what I want to do is identify the three different dimensions along which we make value judgments in relation to language. So first of all, language attitudes have an affective characteristic. So in other words, characteristics that relate to an emotional reaction. Right? So these are the sensations, the feeling and emotions that we experience in response to a certain context, a certain language, or a certain variety of a language. So for example, you might hear someone say something like, oh, I love the sound of Italian. Yeah, Italian is a beautiful language. It's often described as so Italian, and at least in the European context, Italian and French are often described as beautiful languages. Or people might not like certain accents or dialects. I hate that dialect. I don't like that accent. So there's an emotional response to different varieties. There's also a cognitive dimension or cognitive characteristics linked to our knowledge. So this is related to the attributes and functions that we associate with a certain language variety. For example, we might describe an accent as a working class accent because we associate that with working class people. We might be able to identify where a particular dialect of our language is spoken geographically. So remember those maps that I showed you? That's what that kind of study aims to identify. What people know about speakers in relation to where they live or where they come from. And then finally, you have a behavioral response or behavioral characteristics. In other words, we display an intention to act in a particular way when we hear someone speak or when we see someone's written language. So for example, as we said before, with the emotional response, Italian is a beautiful language. Therefore, in terms of my behavioral characteristics, I'd like to start studying Italian. I want to learn Italian. Or in a more negative light, if they speak like that, I won't employ them. And I've got examples I can show you in a moment, examples of how this is very much a real problem in certain contexts. Okay, so these are examples that I've taken from a BBC survey on accent attitudes in the UK. Okay, and so the first one, you've got an emotional response. So this is the affective dimension, and the participant in the study talks about having a great liking for Yorkshire accents. So Yorkshire is in the north of England. And it's often associated, this accent is often associated with friendliness, right? So people sound warm and genuine. And then by contrast, I'm not keen on the Southeast accent, which sounds emotionless and cold. So people are making judgments about where people come from based on the way they speak. And they're making certain stereotypical associations with those accents. So people in the north of England are friendlier than people in the south of England. And hearing someone with that accent is enough to make you think they are either friendly or unfriendly. And then the second example here is, this relates to that behavioral characteristic. So my northern accent once cost me a job. In other words, I didn't get the job because of my accent. I was up for a role in the city, so this is a person who was being interviewed for a job in the City of London in the financial sector. I completed the technical tests. I was told I was technically the best person for the job, but that my accent would not have given the correct image for the bank. So you see this very, very strong connection between the way someone speaks and what personality traits we assume they have, what level of education we assume they have, and what kind of technical ability they have. Okay, so the key evaluations that we tend to make in relation to languages are we assume that there are certain intrinsic linguistic properties which make one language or one language variety superior or another inferior. We associate aesthetic qualities with different varieties. So we are very often found to describe languages as either beautiful or ugly. We make these aesthetic value judgments. But what we can say is that the way we evaluate, and I said this earlier, the way we evaluate, they're not individual beliefs, they're not individual attitudes, right? So the way we evaluate a different accent or a different way of speaking is very much a social convention. So we learn these attitudes. We make judgments on the basis of someone's education, level of intelligence, their employability, all because of social convention and social stereotypes in relation to particular groups of people. Okay, so ways of speaking are very commonly associated with personality features, such as being friendly or being trustworthy. Okay. Now, an important point to signal here is that when we have these reactions to language varieties, that tells us a lot more about people's perception of the speakers of those varieties, not the language varieties themselves. So what we can say, and this is where the theory comes in, so in applied linguistics, where we've studied this, we've described this as a social connotations hypothesis. So in other words, language attitudes are the result of social, cultural, regional, political, and personal associations and prejudices. And the really key point here is that these value judgments have no basis in linguistic fact. So if we provide a linguistic description or a linguistic analysis of different ways of speaking the language, we can say that all varieties of the language are linguistically equal, but from a social perspective, they are not treated as equal. Some are assigned a lot of value, and others are seen as problematic. What we can say, so just to finish on language attitudes are very widespread. Everybody seems to be willing to express a value judgment in response to language. They are strongly influenced by social and political factors. They are often based on social prejudices. They are acquired, this is a key point, they are acquired early in life. So we learn through processes of socialization, we learn to have these beliefs about different languages and different language varieties. What that means is they are less amenable to change in later life. So it's difficult to change them. Once you have a particular perception of a language or a particular perception of an accent in a language or a dialect in a language, it's difficult to change that. They have significant political, educational and economic consequences, as we've seen, and then they have an impact on language planning and policy. And this is something that I'm going to pick up on in my next lecture. We'll be talking about language planning and language policy, particularly in education. Right? But for now, we'll move on to talk about language ideologies. I'm going to pause briefly. I'm not going to put you into breakout rooms again. Just wanted to see if there's anything in the chat. Yes, okay. That's very interestingly put. If you are a Glaswegian Scotsman, people down in Englandshire usually look on you as a crime machine. Yes, okay. People make very, very strong assumptions about who we are, what level of education we have, what kind of job we have, what our personality is like, simply when they hear us speak, so on the basis of our accents. All right, good, okay. I like to pause when I'm in a lecture every so often just to make sure people are still with me and I'm not, my internet connection hasn't cut out and I'm not speaking to myself. Right, I'll go back to the slides. We're now going to move on to talk about language ideologies. All right. So essentially what we mean by language ideologies are ideas about language with regard to society. So it's really looking at the social structures underpinning those language attitudes and beliefs about language that we've already talked about. An important point that Wardour and Fuller make in their book, which is an introduction to sociolinguistics, is that these ideas are usually unconscious. So we have quite strong beliefs, but we don't realize that they are beliefs. All right. Another description, an older one, according to Silverstein, language ideologies are sets of beliefs about language articulated by users as a rationalization or justification of perceived language structure and use. And that's the important point, that it's perceived. So again, there's no basis in linguistic fact. In terms of studying language ideologies, the primary ones that have been identified from language ideology research are monolingual ideology, the one nation, one language ideology, and then finally the standard language ideology, which is probably the most studied and the most widely discussed. So the first one, monolingual ideology, this is the perception that being monolingual is normal. So monolingualism is the norm. And you see this belief in a lot of language, sort of second language acquisition research. So, or in language teaching. So when we look at language teaching, we predominantly think about the model of English that we present in the classroom from a monolingual perspective. So we teach English in English, and we don't teach translation. So there's a strong assumption that monolingualism is the norm, when in fact, being monolingual is actually quite unusual. If you're a native speaker of English, then monolingualism is quite commonplace. If English is not your first language, then you are probably not monolingual. And that's really important to illustrate. The concept one nation, one language ideology, there's a really strong sort of political identification here. So there's this strong belief that a nation state, in order for it to be, to have a strong identity, needs a single language. We need to have one national language. So there's this strong connection between a nation as an entity and the language that nation speaks. And you see this a lot in the United States. So there have been quite a lot of movements in recent years to make English the only official language of the United States, because other languages are often seen as or they're perceived as a threat to national unity and national identity. Standard language ideology is the belief that there is one correct way of using a language. And this is, as I say, the most widely discussed. And this question of standard language ideology relates really strongly to the concept of authority in language. And this is something that has been, again, discussed quite widely. So Milroy and Milroy here are talking about how we tend to accept the authority of prescriptive pronouncements about language. So we often believe that there are correct and incorrect ways of speaking, and a lot of people will accept, mistakenly, that their own speech, to the extent that it is non-standard, is ungrammatical. So non-standard varieties are often described as being ungrammatical. We make strong value judgments about non-standard varieties. And if you do speak a non-standard variety, you are, what Milroy and Milroy say is you usually accept that you don't have authority. Yeah, that authority in language means that your way of speaking is somehow incorrect. Okay, it's very, very commonplace. So language ideologies, what we can say about them is that they are shared by groups. Again, so there's a social, they are learned socially. They affect people's behavior, sometimes in unconscious ways. They can have significant political, educational, and economic consequences. Okay, so if, for example, you do not speak the standard variety, then it's much more difficult to gain access to opportunities for education and opportunities for employment, because those standard varieties are the ones that have all the status. They relate to power and inequality and the maintenance of inequality. So it's very difficult to have equal status in a work environment, in a professional context, or in an educational setting if you don't speak with the right kind of accent. Okay. The problem is they're also more difficult to identify than language attitudes. Language attitudes are easy to identify because people tell us things like, oh, that sounds strange, or I don't like the sound of that. With language ideologies, they are much more difficult to identify because the language ideologies are not explicitly stated. Yeah, if you look at, for example, the marking criteria for assessment in a university, the assumption is that you must write in standard English and you will be judged in a very negative way if you don't. That's not necessarily made explicit. Okay, so it's really important that we study these. And there's quite a lot of studies have looked at language ideologies, particularly standard language ideology. Here you have Ilana Shahami, speaking about language ideologies. And she goes as far as to say that language is used as a form of control. So remember what I was saying in the previous slide about the maintenance of inequality. Okay, so if we look at language, if we look at the properties of language, it's dynamic. So we know that it varies from one context to another. It changes over time. So she's describing the social properties of language: dynamic, personal, free, energetic, no defined boundaries. Okay, but we have, through authority, people in positions of power want to control and manipulate language in order to promote political, social, economic, and personal ideologies. So what she says is it's a form of control. That's quite a significant argument, a really, really important point. Okay. Now you remember, I'm going to play a short video clip. We're just going to listen to a couple of minutes of this. This is from a TED talk. You remember that language myth that we talked about before? The meanings of words should not be allowed to change. And I said, okay, have a think about the word nice. How would you define it? I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. How would you define the word nice? Okay. So that's how do you define the word nice? That's an interesting one. Okay, think about that. I won't go to the questions yet. I guess we'll have time. I'll come back to those at the end. Am I right in thinking that we'll come back to the questions afterwards? Yeah. Okay. Good. Right. But yes, short answer to that question, yes, is yes. Okay. I'm going to share my screen, but this time we're going to watch this short video clip. Okay. Right. So here's an example of language change over time. All right. 20 words that once meant something very different. And here you've got nice. Yeah. Nice. You know what nice means. I asked you to think about that before. The word used to mean silly, foolish, or simple. So you can see that it's very, very different from its meaning today. So in modern English, it's used as a compliment. It's a positive adjective. We say something is nice if we like it. Okay. So you can see nice used to have a very different meaning. And silly, by contrast, which we now think of as sort of stupid, it's gone in the opposite direction. So earlier on, it used to refer to things worthy or blessed. So it then later came to mean vulnerable and now foolish. All right. So you can see, and here's a list. You've got 20 words there, just 20 examples. All right. But what I want us to do is to listen to Anne Curzon, who is a linguist working in the United States. And she's talking about this. So what she's talking about relates to this concept of authority and ideologies underpinning language. Okay.
I need to start by telling you a little bit about my social life, which I know may not seem relevant, but it is. When people meet me at parties and they find out that I'm an English professor who specializes in language, they generally have one of two reactions. One set of people look frightened. They often say something like, "Oh, I better be careful what I say. I'm sure you'll hear every mistake I make." And then they stop talking. And they wait for me to go away and talk to someone else. The other set of people, their eyes light up and they say, "You are just the person I want to talk to." And then they tell me about whatever it is they think is going wrong with the English language. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a dinner party and the man to my right started telling me about all the ways that the internet is degrading the English language. He brought up Facebook and he said, to defriend? I mean, is that even a real word? I want to pause on that question. What makes a word real? My dinner companion and I both know what the verb defriend means. So when does a new word like defriend become real? Who has the authority to make those kinds of official decisions about words anyway? Those are the questions I want to talk about today. I think most people, when they say a word isn't real, what they mean is it doesn't appear in a standard dictionary.
Okay, now I realize you can hear that, but you can't see the video, can you? That's it. Let me try it again. So hopefully so far you will have been able to understand what she's talking about. So it's this question of what counts as a real word. Yep. So she has people complain. So the word that she comments on, I'll put it in the chat, is defriend. Okay, that someone she met in a social setting said to her, "Oh, I don't like the word defriend. It's not even a real word." Okay, so she goes on to talk about this and what counts as a real word. So I'm going to go back to the video, but this time close it from the presentation and open it in a separate window. See if I can sharing it that way will work better. Okay. Hold on, bear with me for a moment. Sorry, I'll just copy that. Okay.
Before I go any further, let me clarify my role in.
Okay, let's see if this will work now. All right, so I'll share my screen again and see if we can see the video this time.
All of this. I do not write dictionaries. I do, however, collect new words, much the way dictionary editors do. And the great thing about being a historian of the English language is that I get to call this research. When I teach the history of the English language, I require that students teach me 2 new slang words before I will begin class. Over the years, I have learned some great new slang this way, including hangry, which is when you are cranky or angry because you are hungry, and adorkable, which is when you are adorable in kind of a dorky way. Clearly terrific words that fill important gaps in the English language. But how real are they if we use them primarily as slang and they don't yet appear in a dictionary? With that, let's turn to dictionaries. I'm going to do this as a show of hands. How many of you still regularly refer to a dictionary, either print or online? Okay, so that looks like most of you. Now, a second question, again, a show of hands. How many of you have ever looked to see who edited the dictionary you are using? Okay, many fewer. At some level, we know that there are human hands behind dictionaries, but we're really not sure who those hands belong to. I'm actually fascinated by this. Even the most critical people out there tend not to be very critical about dictionaries, not distinguishing among them and not asking a whole lot of questions about who edited them. Just think about the phrase, "look it up in the dictionary," which suggests that all dictionaries are exactly the same. Consider the library here on campus, where you go into the reading room and there is a large unabridged dictionary up on a pedestal in this place of honor and respect, lying open so we can go stand before it to get answers. Now, don't get me wrong, dictionaries are fantastic resources, but they are human and they are not timeless. I'm struck as a teacher that we tell students to critically question every text they read, every website they visit, except dictionaries, which we tend to treat as unauthored, as if they came from nowhere to give us answers about what words really mean. Here's the thing. If you ask dictionary editors, what they'll tell you is they're just trying to keep up with us as we change the language. They're watching what we say and what we write and trying to figure out what's going to stick and what's not going to stick. They have to gamble because they want to appear cutting edge and catch the words that are going to make it, such as LOL. But they don't want to appear faddish and include the words that aren't going to make it. And I think a word that they're watching right now is YOLO. You only live once.
Okay, thank you. I didn't enlarge it because I was worried that it was going to disappear again altogether. So I know it was really small for you, sorry. But the key point here, let me go back to my slides, okay? So the key point here is that what she talks about is that underpinning the way people refer to a dictionary is a really strong sense of authority and a strong sort of standard language ideology. So we believe if it's in the dictionary, it must be a real word. But we don't question the authorship of the dictionary because we see the dictionary as the source of knowledge about the language. But the point that she's making, of course, is that dictionaries are written by humans. Yep. So dictionary writers are interested in how the language is being used and how the language is changing. Okay, but we tend not to think about a dictionary in that way. She makes the really important point that a dictionary is not timeless, because it only captures language in a particular moment of time. 10 years from now, the dictionary will be, 5 years from now, a dictionary will be out of date. Okay, it needs to be updated to reflect the way the language is changing. Okay, so I'm going to move on from talking about those language ideologies to now think about language and identity, because what I've said so far in relation to attitudes and ideologies has a really important impact on language and identity. So I'm going to do what I did before. So I'm going to the dictionary. This is the Cambridge Online Dictionary. Remember what Anne Curzon was saying, you need to think critically, you need to read texts critically, including dictionaries, right? So I'm going to take a critical stance on this. So this is the Cambridge Online Dictionary definition of identity. It's who a person is, or the qualities of a person or group that make them different from others. Yeah, so the man's identity was being kept secret. I cannot reveal the identity of my source. And you have several different examples, all right? The key point that I want to highlight is how identity in this dictionary is described as who we are, yeah, or the qualities we have, okay? Now, a much more different way of thinking about identity is not that our identity is who we are, because that's not constant. It changes in the way language is the same way that languages change. We as individuals change over time, and we are different people we are different people in different situations, and we are different people to the others around us. So we sort of socially, we interact within groups and networks and hierarchical structures. So we could say that our identity is constructed. You know, we construct an identity. It's not constant. It's not who we are. Okay, it's who we express ourselves to be. So we could also say that identity is contingent. So in other words, it depends on who we are, where we are, what we're doing, what role we are performing in a given context. And so in essence, we all have multiple identities, and the concept of identity is more fluid than this dictionary definition would suggest. And this has been really important in language research. So we've looked at identity in this more fluid, constructed way. And this is highlighted in the words of Bonnie Norton, who said in relation to identity that every time we speak, we are negotiating and renegotiating our sense of self in relation to the larger social world and reorganizing that relationship across time and space. So gender, race, class, ethnicity, sexual orientation, among other characteristics, are all implicated in this negotiation of identity. In other words, we need language in order to construct our identities in these different contexts. Okay, so there's this really strong connection between language and identity. However, it has also been discussed that the term itself, identity, is quite ambiguous and problematic. And so in the literature in recent years, these have been provided as alternative suggestions. Right? So rather than talk about identity, which gives the impression that it is something that we are or something that we have, and that it is constant over time and unchanging from one context to another. Yeah, instead of thinking about identity, we can think about identification. So it's not something we are or have, it's something we do. By using the term identification or the verb identify, we are then highlighting, or we are foregrounding the active construction or the active processes involved in constructing these identities. Okay, we also can talk about it from the point of view of how we see ourselves, so our understanding as members of a social group, but also we understand our own sense of self, but also we are located by others around us. And what's interesting here is that there may be a difference between the way we identify and the way other people categorize us, or the way we understand our sense of self and the way other people locate us in different social settings. All right. And other important concepts to think about in relation to this are commonality. So what do we have what do we share in common with other people around us in terms of ethnicity, race, language, religion, and so on. Connectedness, so in what ways are we connected with other people that we interact with? And in what ways is there a sense of group identity or groupness? Right? So we belong to different groups. To what extent are those groups? Can we connect with those groups? Okay, good. This is really important. So what I'm going to do now is show you some examples of from a research project where the focus of the project was looking at the connection between language and identity. So the focus of this was a European funded project that I was involved in with King's College London and another 7 universities across Europe. So we had partner universities in Italy, Sweden, Portugal, Poland, and Romania, and France. Sorry, that's all of them. All right. So it was a large European project. And the idea was to explore personal language biographies. So we were interested in how people talked about their experience of different languages. And the idea here was to look at promoting self-reflection among learners of languages and language professionals, including language teachers, in order that these professionals and learners might revalue language and dialect. And the ultimate goal was to promote a greater understanding of multilingualism. Now, remember what I said before about monolingual ideology. Yeah. So an important point here, I'm quoting from the research objectives of the project. So we say that contact with second languages can be the source of negative emotional, cognitive, and pragmatic experiences. Linguistic diversity and pluralism of languages in any context is now a widespread reality. So we were looking at linguistic diversity that is the result of migration. Because we live in a globalized world, we are much more, well, the current pandemic, the current global pandemic notwithstanding, we are a much more globally mobile world than we used to be, I'd say. And the point of the project was to look at how experiences of contact between languages can lead to feelings of rejection of multilingualism and multiculturalism, particularly because of language ideologies. So because of this monolingual ideology and standard language ideology, which elevates certain languages to a position of power and status, that means if you are a speaker of a minority language, you may experience feelings of rejection, and you may experience, particularly in contexts of immigration, you may feel that it's difficult to access opportunities for education and employment and so on. Okay, so it's a research project that looked at these questions, these concepts. And here I'm going to present you with two case studies. One is Carolina. She was a participant in this research project. She has dual heritage and dual nationality, so she is Italian and Swedish. She was born in Italy. At the time of the study, she was born in Italy, was working in Italy as an academic, but her mother is Swedish, right? So she speaks Swedish and Italian. And here she's talking about the feeling of belonging, right? So she says, because from time to time you don't belong either to one culture or to another, I've got experience of that through my mother's suffering. So it's interesting that she uses the word sufferings. It's quite a strong word. She doesn't feel Swedish anymore. So her mother was born in Sweden, lived until she was in her 20s in Sweden, and then moved to Italy to get married. She doesn't feel totally Italian. So she's talking about how her mother is not Swedish anymore because she doesn't live in Sweden any longer, but she also doesn't feel totally Italian. So there's this distinction. So when she got to Italy, at the end of Italy, she was seen as an aliena. So aliena in Italian means foreigner. And as a child, I suffered that. Right? So she talks about her mother's sufferings and how she suffered as a child. And we can explain this through the way in which social structures and social institutions adopt a monolingual ideology. So if you are in Italy and you're Swedish, you're not completely Italian. Yeah. So if she grew up with two parents from different backgrounds with different languages, she feels that she doesn't completely fit in, and that becomes more apparent here later on in her talk. So this is talking to another researcher. The V is the name, is the initial of another researcher. So she says, my mother is not Italian, so I am half. You know, she describes herself as half. So she talks about richness of identity. I tried to work on the complexity of belonging and richness of identity, but I'm half. Okay. And then the researcher, Veronica, this is Veronica, says, you tell yourself as a half, you are not whole or something. So this is, again, this is a symptom, if you like, or a consequence of language ideologies, that you should have one language, and that if you want an identity, so if you want to be considered to have a particular identity, so Italian, then you need to have only Italian as your language. If you've got two languages, then you're not completely Italian. So rather than being double, Italian and Swedish, in the social discourses that she's experienced in her life, she's positioned as, or she's categorized as, someone who doesn't completely belong and is only half of one thing and half of the other. So a much less reductive way of explaining this would be to say that she's double. She's got two identities, okay? But it's not seen in that way. Well, I've got another short video clip. I'm going to do the same thing as I did before. I'll open it in a separate link. This is an illustration of how important language is in relation to questions of identity. And here we're talking about Jamaican Creole, also referred to as patois. So I'm not sure how much you know about pidgins and creoles. So a pidgin language is a hybrid language that's used very often if there is a need for a reduced system, language system. So a simplified grammar and a reduced sort of lexicon, where these pidgins emerged quite a lot through trade in the 19th century and earlier. But a pidgin is a very reduced language system. A Creole is an expanded pidgin, where that pidgin has become the native, the first language of a new community. All right. So Jamaican Creole is that's the first language of people in Jamaica. So in Jamaica, people speak English, but they also speak Jamaican Creole, which is a Creole variety of English. Okay. And the important point here is for me to illustrate the importance of this language in terms of people's identity. Okay. So it's a short clip. Let Margarita go to let me copy and paste the clip, and I'll open it in a different window again. And this time I'll try to maximize it so you can see it more clearly. All right. Okay, alongside the other one. Sorry, bear with me. No, that's not working. Hold on. Okay, let's try again. Share screen. Right, so you can see this, Jamaica's Patois Bible. So here you have a pastor in the Jamaican church talking about the Bible being translated from English into Jamaican Creole. All right, so you can see here, this is the, okay. Right, good. So I'm going to play this. Hopefully you'll be able to see it and hear it. Is that okay?
I see the devil come, yes, as in could have quinta, yes, there's a rock out. That means that Jesus and the devil, they are going like them have some kind of banter. So it's like you watch a little movie, so it's very visual, and it brings some excitement to the word of God. So no longer you're still gonna have to read because you have to read the word of God, but it's so exciting.
Well, you what you say, make you want to tap this, so it make you want go on and go on.
One chapter,
Or pastor, then him come sit down a street side with the boy them, and him chat same way with them, come dress down same way. Same thing with the scripture, just come like Jesus, the righteous, so we are chat with me, same way so.
No, for the majority of us here in Jamaica, Patois is our mother tongue. It's our heart language. It's a language we speak before we start going to school. Now, I'm going to read a passage from the account of the angel Gabriel going to Mary and speaking to her. I'm going to read it first in English, and then I'm going to read it in Patois. Here's what it says in English. The angel went to her and said, "Greetings, you who are highly favored. The Lord is with you." Now, for the very first time, the scriptures have been translated into Patois. This is a new and exciting development. I'm going to read that same passage in our Jamaican New Testament. The angel got to Mary and said to her, say, "Mary, me have news that's going to make you well happy. God really, really bless you. And he will walk with you all the time." An excerpt from the Jamaican New Testament, the Gospel of Luke, written for the very first time. Some persons believe the scriptures in Patois cannot contain all the variations and nuances of scripture. But it's not true, is it? It comes alive and you understand it. Some persons also believe that it is actually bad English. The linguists have supported us by saying that it's not even English. It's not bad English. It's not poor English. It's not English. It is Patois, our language. And a critical part of this translation is that our language is what makes us who we are. We are Jamaicans.
Okay, right, great. Thank you very much. So I'll go back now. I'll go back to the slides again. Great. Okay, so hopefully you got that. So I like that clip because it's a very, very good illustration of the importance of language to the concept of culture and identity. And you can see how proud the pastor is that the Bible has now been translated into Jamaican Creole or into Patois. All right. I'll be interested in the chat, in the discussion on your thoughts about that. Okay, so I said I had 2 case studies. Here's the second one. This is, so it's part of that same research project where we were looking at language and identity in the context of migration. And the participant here is Priya. She is from India, and she identifies as Anglo-Indian. All right, so you can see, she says, I was born and brought up in a small town in Tamil Nadu. Tamil Nadu is a state in the southeast of India. You can see on the map there. Okay, that's where she was born and where she grew up. But she says, so she talks about her identity in relation to the languages that she spoke growing up. Since my mother was not Tamil, she was not accepted into my father's family, and we lived away from them with no ties. As far as my memory can reach, English was the only language we spoke at home. So what's really important to highlight here is that she identifies as Anglo-Indian because she is of mixed heritage, but also because English is she considers English to be her first language. It's her mother tongue. Okay, so I remember hearing my mother speak Tamil to my father, but I don't remember speaking Tamil myself. So she does speak Tamil, but as a child, she could only utter a few basic words. So she's growing up in a context where Tamil is the majority language. She doesn't speak that language very well. English is her dominant language. And then later on, when interviewed, she talks about how she felt discriminated against, and that she needed to describe to people. So even though she's grown up speaking English, when she came to study at university in London, she was asked to take the IELTS test to demonstrate her proficiency in English, which she says was a kind of discrimination. So the point that she's making, that she doesn't feel that people identify her, so they don't categorize her in the same way that she identifies herself. She identifies as a native speaker of English, but she's not seen as a native speaker of English because of her ethnicity and because she was born in India. Okay, so she's had this identity called into question throughout her lifetime. Right. She also talks about an experience she had whilst at university in London. So one of the students on her course at university said, I'm a little prejudiced. So this is the other student talking to her. I'm prejudiced about what you said the other day. How can you claim English to be your first language? Yeah? So the other students on her degree course were questioning her claims to be a native speaker. So you can see this difference between how she identifies as Anglo-Indian, as a native speaker of English, and how other people see her primarily because of her ethnicity. Okay, she talks about having dark skin and not looking like she's an English speaker. Okay, so I'm going to just finish up now. In summary, what we've talked about in relation to, if I go right back to the beginning and say that my purpose here was to talk about the social dimension of language and examine how social properties of language influence the beliefs that we have about language, and the ideologies underpinning those beliefs, but also how that has an impact on our identity. So if we look at language from a social perspective, we can say that language is adaptive, it changes over time, and it varies from one context to another. It is, in other words, very complex. It's dynamic. It's emergent because language is always becoming as people speak it. It's very fluid. It's localized and performed. So when we look at language, if we take a dictionary, as I said, it's only a partial representation of the language. No matter how big a dictionary is, it can't be a full representation of any language because of how emergent and fluid and dynamic languages are. So in applied linguistics, this has led people in recent years to not talk about languages, but rather to talk about languages and languaging. Okay, so people using language are in the same way that I said we've moved from thinking about identity to thinking about identification, we can do the same with language. So language is not a system; it's more of it's a system, but it's also enacted. It's performed. Okay, so we can highlight the processes involved in performing language by talking about languaging. In other words, doing language, if you like. So we can. So that's what language is, but if we think about language ideologies, because of the language ideologies underpinning our beliefs about language, we often see language as fixed in time and place. We regard it as an autonomous system separate from individual people, separate from location. It becomes standardized, and then we assign a lot of prestige and value to those standardized forms or those standardized varieties, to the extent that people who don't speak those standard varieties can experience discrimination and prejudice, right? And that's really why it's important to think about language attitudes and ideologies, and particularly to do so in relation to language identity and the way we identify through language and with language. Okay, right, and that's pretty much it. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to stop there. Right, I think we might need to unmute.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Martin Dewey, for this very inspiring lecture. I believe that many of us are now eager to share and discuss with you on this matter. It's now time for Q&A. If you have any questions for our professor, please raise your virtual hand and turn on your microphone. Or maybe you can use the chat feature in this session to ask your question. You can add your questions to the chat if you like. Is there anyone? Maybe I should start asking question. Okay, so my question to you is that what do you think is the best approach to mediating students' language attitudes? For example, how can we improve their tolerance for linguistic differences, making them aware of how language can be used to qualify, to project one's identity, or to establish a sense of community?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. Because as I was saying, the beliefs that we have about language and the beliefs that we have about specific languages are beliefs that we inherit at a very young age. So we hold on to them very strong. We have quite a strong attachment to these beliefs. And it's really important in education, I think, to raise much more awareness of linguistic diversity. And you're right to ask about tolerance of linguistic diversity. There tends to be the default position, because of these language ideologies, is that we shouldn't tolerate diversity. A lot of the time, there's concern. This is expressed as concerns regarding intelligibility. So the concern is that if people all speak with a different accent, or people all have a different variety, a different dialect, then that's going to compromise intelligibility. But what's really important to raise awareness of is not just that there are different varieties, but that individual speakers of these varieties will modify the way they speak in different contexts. So we know from research studies that speakers will accommodate towards the people they're interacting with, and they will modify their speech in order that it becomes more intelligible. So intelligibility doesn't reside in the language variety itself. Intelligibility is constructed by speakers in interaction. So we need to raise awareness of this among students of English and students of any language, and also teachers. And I think it's really important to expose students to a wide range of different varieties of any language, okay, and get them to become more aware of, particularly in the case of English, of where English is spoken, how it is used, what does it sound like, what does English sound like when it's spoken in in India or in Nigeria or in South Africa, or so expose students to lots of different varieties of the language in order that they become much more aware of this. I do this with my students by asking them to think about diversity in their first language. So at the moment, I'm teaching a large group of Chinese students, and we had a seminar discussion last week in which I asked them to talk together about how is your accent in Chinese? Is it different? Is your accent different now than it was when you were growing up? Do you speak Chinese differently from your parents? Do you speak? And they were able to talk about their experiences of moving to different parts of China and then modifying the way they speak because they were exposed to different accents. So I think if it's in an English language teaching context, then it's really good to get students, first of all, thinking about the extent to which there is diversity in their own language, in their first language. And then you can extend that to talk about other languages, including English. Yeah. So people become much more, I think if we have more awareness of diversity globally, then you will have tolerance. Okay. What I also do in some of my teaching is I provide links to Ethnologue, which is a database of world languages. And we look at maps of the world and how many different languages are spoken in different contexts. So that's it. I think that's it. I mean, there are other sources as well. I'll put it in the chat. But Ethnologue is a really useful source of illustrating linguistic diversity in the world. Okay. Right. Good. There was a question earlier in the chat which I referred to very briefly. This was, if we're going back in the chat, 844. How can topics related to linguistic prejudices and stereotypes be crucial for ELT classrooms? Do they reflect how learners' attitudes are affected by the dominant social norm? Yes, they do. Yeah, they do. I think in an ELT setting, I think it's really important to illustrate that the way we model English in the classroom, so that the kind of English that's presented in the textbook is only one particular type of English, that it's linguistically speaking, standard English is a dialect like any other variety of the language. It's linguistically, it's not better than any other variety. It's just that this is the one that we have associated with status and prestige. Yeah, it could be any other variety. So you can look at sort of discussing the power dynamics underpinning the production of teaching materials. Yeah. Because the way we focus on language in ELT, and particularly the way language is talked about in textbooks, is very much influenced by the dominant social norm. Yeah, I mean, awareness of this is growing. Things are gradually changing, but quite gradually. It's a slow thing. Yeah, it's very difficult to make students aware of pre-existing stereotypes. Teachers sometimes are not aware of it. It's about trying to get people to become conscious of the unconscious biases that we all have. So yes, it is difficult to become aware of them, but it's really important that we do. And I think this is why this should be a subject in teacher education. I think in programs of teacher education, there's often a really strong focus on language. So studying and analysing language. So you look at lexis and grammar, phonology, and maybe discourse and pragmatics. And you also then look at teaching methodologies. But in addition to that, we need to think about, we need more of a discussion, I think, of subjects in sociolinguistics. So talking about language and identity, language and power, and the ideologies underpinning the way different languages are perceived in different social settings. That needs to be part of teacher education as well. do you think pre-existing stereotypes influence how we actually comprehend speakers? Yes, they can. I mean, research studies have been shown to do that. We know that the extent to which research participants report that they can understand a listening depends on what they are told about the speaker. So we know that the stereotypes that we might have about someone's social class or their ethnicity can have a negative or a positive impact on how well we think we can understand them. You see this a lot in the media. So there's been some discussion about this recently in the media. So in a lot of the time on the BBC, for example, if in a news report on the BBC they are interviewing someone who has quite a strong localized accent, they will sometimes use subtitles on the screen, which I always find slightly offensive. And I think the speaker being interviewed is probably going to find that offensive, because the assumption is that, because of this person's background, their identity, who they are and how they speak, it's going to be difficult to understand them. If you take away the subtitles, then maybe it's not that difficult to understand. You just have to try harder to engage with their way of speaking, to tune into their way of speaking. But yes, the stereotypes can influence the extent to which we feel that a particular language or language variety is intelligible. It's an important point, that one, yes. I think, okay, yeah, we have a question. Do you want to unmute? I saw a hand go up.
Okay, maybe I have one question then. Based on your experience, I just curious that is there any relationships between the way we perceive our own mother tongue, like a Thai language, for example, and linked to the way we perceive like a English or second language or foreign language? Are there any relationships between these two?
Yeah, I think so. I think because it depends what you've been told at school. So a lot of the time, the sort of stereotypes can become reinforced. And what's problematic in a lot of language teaching methodology resource books, so in teacher handbooks, there's often a section where they describe typical problems that learners have based on their linguistic background. So if you're a Thai speaker of English and you're continually told that because you're Thai, then it's difficult to pronounce this, or it's difficult to say that, or it's difficult to understand this, that's going to reinforce your perception of English being a difficult language to learn. But if you remember one of the slides early on in the lecture, the one that related to common beliefs about language that I took from the Language Myths book, one of them was that some languages are more difficult than others. Now, this is all very relative, but I think it's very easy to overstate the differences between languages, and so therefore make students perceive their ability in that language as somehow compromised. There's no reason. There are two aspects to this, two sort of dimensions to this, if you like. One is sort of linguistically speaking, not wanting to reinforce stereotypes about the differences between the first language and the second language. A lot of second language acquisition research used to make the assumption that the kinds of errors that learners produced were a result of L1 transfer, negative L1 transfer, that used to be called interference. Yeah? Well, thankfully, we've moved on from calling it interference. But when you look closely at research into second language use of English, the first language background has very little impact on the way English is spoken. a lot of the forms that you can identify are common across speakers from all different language backgrounds. So not wanting to overstate that difference is really important. So the other point is what kind of English we are presenting as a model and what kind of English we are basing our assessment on. So if we adopt a very strong norm-based approach, and we're saying to learners that you need to learn either American English or British English, then their achievement is going to be, they're never going to achieve that. So it's going to have a very negative impact on their sense of identity as an English speaker. And I spend a lot of time with my students getting them to identify as speakers of English. And often they'll say, but I'm Thai, I'm not really a speaker of English. I don't speak English. I'm learning English. Well, you can change that mentality. You can change that thinking, especially once we realize that we don't need to be so attached to a particular variety, particularly if it's a minority variety, which Standard British English is. Did that answer that question? I don't know if I addressed that. Okay. There were I saw other hands sort of slightly going up, but it's very difficult to maybe use the raise hand function. I don't know. Then it'll be easier to, right. Yes, we have a raised hand. Thank you. Fatima.
Cannot hear you,
Hello.
Fatima.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
Okay. So I'd like to ask you a question about like ELT priorities, English language teaching priority, especially in teaching pronunciation and English conversation. So where should we focus as a teacher, and me as a mother as well? So where should we focus, like good English, standard English, or English as a lingua franca? So could you please suggest me on that? Thank you very much.
I mean, thank you for the question. I think it depends on the student's needs and on their objectives for learning and where you're teaching them. So I think all too often in the past, teachers, not necessarily teachers, because I think in a lot of contexts, teachers don't have the power to make decisions for themselves. Yeah, it's usually a much more hierarchical decision where teachers are told, here is your course book, you're going to use this book with these students, or it might be a government education policy. It might be a national curriculum telling you, here's the prescribed material. Okay, but where teachers do have choice over what they teach and what they prioritize in their teaching, I think it's really important that teachers engage in conversation with their students, that they talk about what is it, what kind of English do you want to speak? Why do you want to learn this kind of English? How do you want to sound when you speak English? And to make students aware that they can be very intelligible, completely intelligible, successful, effective communicators in English without having an American or British accent. You can have a Thai accent and be very communicative in English. And I think that's really important. So discussing priorities with students is good. That's important. And I think focusing on the relevance of intelligibility rather than sounding like a native speaker is useful. And one way I do this is I show examples of communication breakdown that has occurred because a native speaker of English has been present in an English as a lingua franca interaction. So very often, I mean, we know that there are several research studies that have looked at this and have shown how where miscommunication does occur, it's often the result of a native speaker of English not being able to modify their language use sufficiently for people to be able to understand them. Okay, so I think priorities it's important to think about priorities. It's important to openly discuss priorities with students, and to do so from a sort of critically informed perspective, bearing in mind everything we've said about attitudes and ideologies and identity. Yeah. Okay, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it helps a lot. Thank you very much, Prof.
Right. You're welcome. Thank you. Celine, is that Celine? Please forgive me if I'm pronouncing your names in a terrible fashion.
Yeah, it is. I am not have quite a question like that, but I have an issue. When I was study in Australia, I got some kind of American accent, and then people would say, yeah, Australian people, they said that people might not like you, like me, because I got American accent. So that, you know, that affects a lot. Yeah. But yeah, as far as I understand that, okay, English is a good way of communication that we use as a tool to talk to compensate on the conversation that we have. But yeah, the accent is really matter on how people, you know, attitude, judge and stuff. And also another issue about my student, and I am teaching them pronunciation as well. Some of them, most of them, trying to get a British accent, but they don't care about the pronunciation. You know, yeah, they try to get an English British accent without the correct pronunciation. They prioritize on the accent. Yeah, that's it, Professor.
Okay. Yeah, no, I'm sorry to hear about that experience in Australia. I know, I mean, this is why it's important to talk about language attitudes. People often express views like that about different ways of speaking. And whenever I've done research like this, I've always come across people who talk about having experienced some kind of prejudice. That they will report how someone reacted negatively to the way they spoke English or to the accent that they had. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing that experience. It is a common one, unfortunately. So I think it would be good, not just in teacher education, but in education more broadly, to raise awareness of linguistic diversity. So, I mean, in the UK, there's a lot of discussion about public engagement in science. And there's a lot of discussion about teaching children the value and importance of science. I think we should extend that to talk about the value of understanding social science, to understand the relationship between things like the way we speak language and who we are and how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us, because that can lead to, as I've said, experiences of prejudice or discrimination. On the question of pronunciation teaching, if your students are telling you they want to sound like they want to speak British English, I would ask them why, and say to them, "Are you sure this is really what you want to speak?" Show them that it's a minority variety. It has a lot of power and prestige, but we can challenge that power and prestige. We can change the status of this variety by saying that it's no longer so relevant in language teaching. If you're learning English in Thailand, then you're learning English in Thailand because English is a global language, not because English is spoken in London. It's a global language because English is the official language of ASEAN. So you're learning English in Thailand because if you want to speak to someone from Singapore or Indonesia or the Philippines, the best way to do that is in English. So so regionally and globally, it's a really important language. So that then might lead students to think about this and say, well, okay, so I'm not learning English because I want to live in London. I'm learning English because I want to communicate with people from I want to be a global citizen, if you like. Yeah. I don't know if that suggestion helps, but that's how I've approached it.
Actually, what you have just sharing your experience, it's very, I strongly agree with what you have just mentioned. However, when we look in realities, like in Thailand, for example, it can be clearly seen that English language ideologies of Thai people can sometimes be examined through English pronunciation. Thai people who pronounce English with a Thai accent are looked down on by other groups who have a more native pronunciation. And there are many studies, conduct regarding this particular notion, including our moderator, Ajahn Ratip. And those studies, clearly mention that, okay, the mainstream English was considered as a beautiful, expressive, international, appropriate, perfect, and professional. Comparing to the non-native one, and most of the participants perceived as the unfavorable, broken, stigmatized, or sometimes non-standard and incorrect, for instance. So sometimes, based on the topic that we discussed today, sometimes it's still very, very difficult to change the attitudes or belief of the peoples, especially once a language becomes like a national symbol of a particular country, and it's presenting its national identity and uniqueness. Like in Thailand, for example, where the Thai language is perceived as a symbol of the country and represents the national identity of Thai people. So the language becomes like a frozen and stable under the provided framework or patterns of dominating group of people in Thailand. And some of the language framework, or the patterns provided might not work in contradiction to be practical ways that Thai people use Thai language in their societies. Since most Thai people do not always use standard Thai to contact each other, but regional dialects. So sometimes it's very difficult and it's very challenging when we look back to English language, especially when we try to increase the awareness of the policymakers, teachers, learners, or curriculum designer regarding the English linguistic diversification.
Yeah, no, that's a really important point. I think that's a very good point. Well said. Yeah, I mean, that's totally true. I mean, it's really important that we make very strong associations and very strong connections in terms of power and status and social class. So yeah, that's an important point. I mean, in the context of Thailand, I think that's worth talking about with your students, how the relationship between speaking a regional Thai dialect and speaking standard Thai, that's an easy way of raising awareness of these issues. But yeah, you're totally correct that it is an important issue. It's very difficult, very, very difficult to move away from that, and very difficult to overcome those power imbalances, the inequalities that derive from this way of thinking about languages. Yeah. Yvonne, I think we have next. Hello.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for the detailed explanation. And I got here is language is one of the principal characteristics of cultural identity. And then at the same time, language has different contexts in society and various ways by different actors, right? And language policy and codification can influence people's language usage. So based on those issues, especially related nowadays, mostly we are triggered with the high technology. Based on your analysis and your opinion, would it be possible English as a language, also as a linguistic, are they going to improve, or how can I say, develop or more wider as knowledge, something like that? What do you think, or what is your opinion?
Okay, I think I'm not entirely sure I understand what you mean. I think you're saying that, so you're asking about how English is going to continue to develop as a result of its use through technology. Is that right?
Yes, because at this moment, everything is related with the technology, and then mostly people are, let's say, communicate directly face to face, right? So the terms of terminology of languages mostly related to it. So does it mean it's going to be more improved or more, I don't know how to say it, the linguistic term, are they going to change?
Yeah, okay.
Or
right, so, sure, right, okay, that is an interesting question. I mean, languages, as we've seen right from the beginning of the lecture with the comparison of those three texts, the Old English, the Middle English, and then the early modern English from the Shakespeare text, all languages are continually evolving over time. I wouldn't call that evolution an improvement, because that's making a value judgment. So the evolution happens in response to social circumstances and conditions and environmental, sort of socio-economic and socio-political conditions surrounding languages. And what we've seen increasingly over the past 20 years or so, first of all, with the emergence of the internet and the proliferation of different websites and the way we've moved more towards digital communication, we've seen that really start to take hold at the turn of the century, 20 years ago. I mean, when I was, for example, when I studied my MA, I studied Applied Linguistics MA in 1998. Right, in 1998, as a student on an MA program, I didn't have an email account, and all of the interaction with the tutors and the lecturers was face-to-face or over the telephone. Maybe I sent an email, but I didn't have a university email address or a university email account. And we were given information about the MA degree course on paper, distributed in person. Then when I enrolled for my PhD, 3 years later, 2001, everything was much more digitized and we were communicating through email. Then as what I've seen gradually over the years is we've migrated more and more towards digital platforms for communicating with each other. And we've really seen, obviously, we've all seen that intensify in the past 18 months or so, or 20 months since the beginning of the pandemic, because we've had to completely change the way we interact, change the way we teach, change the way we communicate with each other, change the way we attend conferences. So it's much more virtual, and there's much more communication through digital media, and particularly through social media. And I think for example, my daughter, her generation is often referred to as digital natives. She's 16 and she spends a lot of her time interacting with her phone at the same time that she's interacting in person. So if you see a group of her friends together, to me, it looks quite strange because they're having dinner together and they're talking, but at the same time, they're doing things on their phones. They're texting and messaging and posting photographs on Instagram while they're together in person. So there's this blending together of the face-to-face with the digital and the virtual in a way that someone my generation hasn't really experienced. I still see it as a separate place. And I think that is obviously having quite a big impact on the way we use language. And it has to have an impact on the way we talk about language. So there are lots of people researching online communication and online interaction. And it's now become a big part of linguistics, studying the way people interact. I mean, I think personally it's very exciting that we can interact in this way. So being able to, for example, use emoticons and all sorts of different pictograms while we're speaking or while we're writing text, it's much more blended in terms of the way we interact. So that does have to change the way we think about language and the way we talk about language. So we need new categories to describe language. And these are emerging in sociolinguistics, in the study of language in society. They are emerging, yeah. I wouldn't say improving, I'd say definitely evolving. And I think probably the last 10 years, we've experienced really dramatic change. It's been a period of quite accelerated change in terms of how people communicate with each other. Okay, and there's another, sorry, did that answer your question? Or was it?
Another thing, so it means it's related with one of your presentation related with the dictionary. So yeah. Does it mean like we need to realize that dictionary should be changed? I think nowadays, 5 years, I think, or what do you think? We need to realize that we need to update it, right?
Exactly. We need to regularly update dictionaries. Yeah. And we need, so the dictionary probably needs to be online. So that, I mean, by the time the publisher produces a written version of a dictionary and it goes into print and then it's distributed physically as it's by the time you get hold of it, it's already out of date by a couple of years. So, I mean, I never use print dictionaries any longer. I always go online, you know. So, yeah, so it's important that we do that. It's important that we do that. Okay, there are a couple of questions in the chat now. So, again, apologies if I'm not pronouncing your name appropriately. Kanchai, how can we change nationalism, patriotism in the students' perception? That's a very good question. That's a very difficult thing to do. Students never
yes,
realize
because,
that English is not.
I'm sorry, okay. Yes,
Yeah.
that is because of, I'm trying to see that because we are nationalism for some times. I can see that most students, they never realize that English is very important for them until they are looking for the jobs. Because if we're looking at the attitudes and about the extrinsic and extrinsic attitudes, and then normally they never realize that, okay, until like we as a teacher as well in the universities, and we only have, okay, teach them just only like for the first and the second years, and after that they will looking again, they will see how important of English again when they graduate, and then because many jobs in Thailand, they are requiring for the IELTS test or about the standard test and everything that. So because we have been learning English since we were young, and then I don't know, because this one is something that we already put in our mind until like we were young as well. So how can we change about this one?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a really important question. I think the only way to do it is to talk about it, to make it a topic of discussion in the classroom, in schools. And I think it's, as soon as you start teaching English, I think it's worth talking to students about why English is being taught. Why in Thailand are you teaching English and not German or French or Spanish? Why are you teaching a European, or what used to be a European language? Now it's a world language. So that's the important point. You're teaching English because it's a global language, because it's really important for them. Okay, but yes, nationalism and patriotism are really key issues that I think are worth discussing with students. Okay, there's a very interesting question in the chat now. How do you, as a native speaker, feel when the ownership of English is shared by other non-native speakers? Personally, I welcome that, and I think that it's fantastic that English is shared by so many people. But I know that for a lot of native speakers of English, they are either not aware of this or they feel threatened by it. And a lot of the time, I think if you're a native speaker of English, you feel that you've got a special privilege because you speak the global language. But if you are a native speaker of English, in many senses, you are disadvantaged, because that probably means you are more likely to be monolingual than multilingual. So it's your only language. Yeah. And that means that you don't have a very good understanding of what it means to be involved in intercultural communication. Now, for me, as a native speaker, when I started university, which was a long time ago now, I started university in 1988, and I studied English, literature, and Italian language and literature. So I did Italian degree at university. So for the past 20, how many years is that? 30, oh my gosh. For the past 33 years, I've been involved in some way in language learning and language teaching. So I learned, I studied Italian at university. I lived in Italy for a year. I then traveled to Mexico, lived in Spain, so I speak Spanish. I spent some time studying Japanese. And I've spent a lot of time learning about, I don't speak any Thai, but I know about Thai. So I learn about different languages. And I think that, for me, means that I don't feel threatened by non-native speakers taking ownership of the language, because it's not the only language I've got. Yeah, I speak other languages. And I also know what it feels like to try and identify with another language and identify yourself through that language, to have a Spanish-speaking identity. I know what that's like. It's a challenge. It's a struggle. So for me personally, I think it's great that non-native speakers are taking ownership of the language. And a lot of my teaching relates to that. It relates to promoting that. Yeah? But I know that for some native speakers of English, it probably feels like a threat. They're worried about it. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Based on the question regarding the native speaker, I have received several papers. They're talking about the ownership of English, for example. And it can be clearly seen that, those people, they have clearly mentioned that language now is not belong to any particular group of nations or cultures, especially when English become Englishes. And when we're talking about the number of people who use English nowadays, it's like the number of the majority of people who use English now, they are non-native one, I guess. So I just curious that to what extent do you agree or disagree? I mean, regarding this particular nation, do you still believe that native or non-native speakers still exist, or yes?
Yeah, they do. But I mean, I've written quite a lot about this, and I think I've changed my thinking over the years about this. So I think for a long time I thought that we shouldn't make the distinction between native and non-native, particularly because that distinction usually meant that we were privileging native speakers and discriminating against non-native speakers. I think because we've developed so much in relation to this question of the ownership of English by non-native speakers, I think we can now make that distinction between native and non-native, but without necessarily invoking that power relation. I think so. But I also think it's important to talk about nativeness in relation to identity and identification. And I think it's important to say that you can be a native speaker of any variety of English. It doesn't have, so using the term native speaker of doesn't have to simply be limited to British English and American English or Australian English. Yeah, we can talk about native speakers of Singapore English, native speakers of Indian English, and so on. So the way we make the distinction, I think, is different from how it used to be, and I think it's okay to make the distinction as long as we don't as long as we don't invest power in the native speaker. Yeah. Did that answer your question? Hopefully that answered your question.
Yes, it's really clear. Yes, thank you.
There's an interesting one. Do you think English language teachers from Scotland should reduce their accents in their EFL classrooms? I would take just yes or no for an answer. Okay, how about yes and no for an answer? Does that work? Yeah. So I think if they are teaching in Scotland, yeah, then by all means they should speak with a Scottish accent, but possibly a modified, slightly less localized Scottish accent, as long as it's intelligible. Yeah. If they're teaching in a very different environment, then maybe they need to modify their accent a little bit. But I don't think they should completely reduce their accent. I think you can teach English with a Scottish accent, you can teach English with a British accent, or you can teach English with a Thai accent. All right. I'm going to have to go now because I've got some students of my own waiting.
Yes.
For a meeting. So it's 10 o'clock. It's 10:04 here, and I've got evaluation form. Great, thank you. So that's for everybody to do, not me, right? Okay, good. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening to me, taking part in the discussion. There's been some very interesting questions here. Thank you very much. And also, thank you for putting up with my not entirely fluent use of technology. Okay, hopefully that wasn't too much of an issue while you were waiting for me to find the link and everything else. All right.
And
so thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you very much for your thought-provoking section, and we hope to see you again for your second sections shortly.
Yeah. I'll be back with you. Hopefully, see all of you again in January.
Yes,
I can't remember the date.
Yeah, everyone, please stay tuned in January. We are going to meet Professor Dr. Martin Dewey again in January. Yes,
thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Yes, thank you very much. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
All right, for audience, before you leave, please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation form in the link added to the chat, and please